I still remember the night of his retirement party, the room filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the kind of joy you'd expect after a lifetime of work. But in the middle of it all, when the toasts were done and everyone was busy celebrating him, he leaned close to me, his breath heavy with drink, and whispered words that froze my heart. He said, "You're not coming to Florida, it's just me and the boys." And I smiled, because what he never knew, what none of them knew, was that 2 weeks earlier, I had already bought the house right next door. Thank you so much for watching and for giving me a little of your time. It truly means more than I can ever put into words. Before I go on with my story, I would love to know where you are watching from. So please leave me a comment and tell me. I always enjoy hearing from you. Now let me take you back to that night again. Because while I stood there smiling as if nothing had happened, inside of me, there was a storm. His whisper was still echoing in my mind, sharp and cruel, and yet I refused to let him see the pain he had caused. Instead, I held my head high, and I reminded myself of everything I had already discovered. The hidden papers, the signatures I wasn't supposed to see, the quiet phone calls when he thought I was asleep. All of it had prepared me for this moment, and while he believed he had spoken the final word on our future, I knew the truth, that I had already written my own ending, one that would leave him silent and me standing strong. I had spent my whole life standing beside him, through every season, through the long nights when he came home tired and angry from work, through the years when money was tight and I stretched every dollar until it nearly tore, through the quiet sacrifices that no one ever applauded, but I made them anyway, because I believed in us. I believed in the dream we both spoke about when we were young, that one day, when his working years were done, we would finally live for ourselves. And Florida was supposed to be that dream. Warm mornings, long walks by the water, evenings sitting together watching the sun disappear into the horizon. All of it was painted in my mind like a promise. But now I realized it had never really been our dream. It had been his, something he built for himself and his friends. And I was nothing more than a shadow in the background, invisible when the light turned toward them. The truth is, I had never asked for much. I was content with small things, with family dinners, with the sound of laughter filling the house, with the pride of knowing I raised my children with values and strength. And I thought that counted for something. I thought he saw it. I thought he understood that the life we had built was not made of his paychecks alone, but of the endless work I put in behind the scenes. The meals cooked, the tears hidden, the loneliness swallowed when he was too busy or too tired to care. All of it was the foundation beneath his career, beneath his freedom. And yet, he had the courage to whisper those words to me. Words that told me I was not part of the future he dreamed of. Words that reduced me to an afterthought in the story I had helped him write. It hurt in ways I cannot fully describe. The kind of hurt that doesn't make you scream, but instead sits deep in your chest like a stone, heavy and unmovable. And as I stood there that night smiling at the party, I kept thinking of all the years I had given. The years I could never get back. And I asked myself quietly, how many times had he looked at me and already decided I was no longer needed? How long had he planned this escape? How long had he laughed behind closed doors with his friends about a future I wasn't invited to? But even as those thoughts burned inside me, there was another voice in me. One that said, hold on. Do not show them your pain, because your time is coming. And when it arrives, it will not be with shouts or tears. It will come with a quiet strength that no one can take away from you. As I stood there that night, smiling through the pain and swallowing the bitterness that his whisper left inside me, I reminded myself of the truth only I knew. The truth that gave me the strength to keep my chin lifted and my heart steady. Because 2 weeks earlier, while I was sorting through some pension paperwork, the kind of dull task that most wives handle without a second thought, I had stumbled across something that didn't sit right with me. A set of numbers that didn't match what he told me. A signature that looked rushed, and hidden transfers that carried a weight he never mentioned. At first I brushed it off, thinking maybe I was imagining things. But the longer I studied those pages, the clearer it became that he had been moving money without saying a word to me, quietly funneling funds toward a dream I was never meant to share. I can still remember the way my hands shook as I turned each page, the sound of the paper scratching against the table, and the silence in the house that night felt heavier than any noise. I looked around our home, at the pictures on the walls, the furniture we had bought together, the small marks of life and love that only a family can leave behind. And I realized he had been planning to walk away from all of it, to trade the story we built for laughter and cocktails with his friends. And he had the courage to believe I would simply accept it, as if I had no mind of my own, as if I had no say in the life we were supposed to live together. I sat there at that table for hours, staring at those papers, tears welling but never falling. Because in that moment, something inside me shifted. The sadness gave way to a kind of strength I had never felt before, a quiet determination that whispered back to me, "You will not be discarded, you will not be left behind, and you will not beg for a place at a table you helped build." And from that night forward, I carried that strength with me. Every time he laughed too loudly on the phone with his friends, every time he spoke of retirement as if it belonged to him alone, I no longer felt powerless. Instead, I was watching him, learning his steps and preparing mine in silence. It was during one of those late nights, when he thought I was asleep, and I overheard the muffled excitement in his voice, talking about a villa, about Florida, about the freedom he and his boys would soon enjoy, that I knew exactly where to look. And the very next morning, I made a call of my own, to a realtor whose voice was calm and steady. And in that call, I began to write a new ending to a story he believed was already finished. I toured homes, walked through sunlit rooms, imagined myself in a space that was mine alone, no longer bound by his whispers or his betrayals. And when I finally signed the papers and held the keys in my hand, I felt a peace settle over me, because I knew that while he was busy building a life without me, I had quietly built one that would stand right beside his, strong, unshaken, and undeniable. When I think back on those days, what strikes me most is how blind I had been to the signs that were already there. Because the truth is, betrayal does not arrive all at once. It creeps in slowly, hidden beneath small changes and half-truths that you almost convince yourself to ignore. And now I could see them all with painful clarity. The way he started coming home later than usual, claiming he was caught up in meetings that always seemed to run long. The way his laughter sounded lighter when he spoke on the phone, but only when he thought I wasn't near enough to hear. The way he stopped asking me about my dreams, about what I wanted our retirement to look like, as if my voice no longer mattered in the picture he was painting. I remembered the nights I would set dinner on the table and wait, the food growing cold while I sat in silence, telling myself he was working hard for our future. And yet in reality, he was laying bricks for a life I was never meant to walk into. He stopped talking about we and began talking about me. Subtle at first, so subtle I almost missed it. But once I caught it, I heard it everywhere. In every sentence, in every plan, in every pause between his words. The truth was already spilling out, and I just hadn't wanted to face it. And it was in those moments that my heart broke the hardest. Not at the thought of Florida, not at the thought of being left behind, but at the realization that the man I had shared my life with had long ago chosen to stand apart from me. And he hadn't even cared enough to hide it well. And yet, in the middle of that heartbreak, there was also a strange sense of freedom. Because once you finally see betrayal for what it is, once you stop making excuses for it, you are no longer chained to it. I looked at him differently after that. I stopped seeing him as the keeper of my future, and instead I saw him for what he was. A man desperate for freedom he thought he could only find by erasing me. And I realized that I did not need his permission to create a life of my own. I had already done it once before, when I raised my children, when I kept our home alive through hardship, when I carried the weight of silence on my back. And I knew then I could do it again. Only this time not in the shadows, but in the light of my own strength. And with every step I took toward securing that house, I was not just preparing for Florida, I was reclaiming my dignity piece by piece. And no whisper, no plan, no betrayal could ever take that away from me again. The more I thought about it, the clearer everything became. Because betrayal has a way of sharpening your memory. It forces you to see the patterns you once overlooked. And I began to realize that his dream of Florida had never truly included me. He had spoken about warm beaches and golf courses with his friends for years, but rarely had he spoken about walking with me by the shore or sitting together watching the sun fade. And now I knew why. Those dreams were built around his own escape, around a version of freedom that meant leaving behind the woman who had held everything together for so long. And as painful as it was, I refused to let that be the end of my story. I held the keys to my own house, and with them came a new kind of strength. Every time I looked at those papers I had signed, I felt a sense of control I hadn't felt in decades. It wasn't about revenge, it wasn't even about proving him wrong. It was about reminding myself that I was still capable of choosing my own path. And if he wanted to run away with his so-called boys, let him. Because I would be right there, not chasing after him, not begging for his attention, but living fully in my own right. And the thought of it gave me a calm smile he never noticed. A quiet satisfaction that warmed me even on the coldest nights. I imagined the moment he would arrive in Florida, his chest puffed out with pride, laughing with his friends, certain he had left me behind in the dust. And then I imagined the look on his face when he realized that I was already there, already settled, already living the life he thought I couldn't claim without him. That image stayed with me, steady and comforting, and it gave me patience, because I knew that while he whispered betrayal into my ear, I was carrying a louder truth inside me, one that would not need words, one that would speak for itself when the time finally came. And it was that thought, that quiet vision of his shock and my calm, that gave me the strength to keep walking forward with my head high and my heart unbroken. I kept moving forward with that quiet strength, each day adding another layer of preparation to the life I was building for myself. And though he never noticed, my world was shifting in ways he could not imagine. I began taking walks through neighborhoods that felt alive with promise, listening to the sound of palm trees swaying in the breeze, smelling the salt in the air, and I could almost feel the freedom waiting for me. I sat across from realtors who looked me in the eye with respect, explaining contracts and pointing out details, and each signature I placed on those documents was like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been buried under years of silence. By the time the last paper was signed and the keys were pressed into my hand, I felt lighter, as if the weight of his betrayal no longer held me down. Because I knew the ending of this story would not be the one he had written in secret. The house I chose was not grand or boastful, but it had warmth, it had space that felt alive with possibility. I walked through the rooms imagining where I would place the furniture. I ran my hand across the counters and thought of mornings where I would make coffee without waiting for anyone, evenings where I would sit on the patio and breathe deeply, knowing I was free. And I thought of my children visiting, their laughter filling the hallways, a reminder that while he was chasing freedom in the company of men who did not know the meaning of sacrifice, I was creating a home that would always carry the spirit of love and dignity. I pictured holidays spent on my own terms, not as someone's discarded shadow, but as a woman who stood firm in the life she chose. He still walked around the house we shared, bragging about plans, whispering into the phone about flights and golf trips, smiling in ways that cut me deeper than he realized, and yet I no longer felt powerless listening to him, because I already had my answer. My victory was not in arguments or raised voices, it was in silence. It was in knowing that while he believed he was clever, while he believed he had hidden everything from me, I had turned that secrecy into my own opportunity. I had taken the very money he thought he was using to erase me and built something that would stand right beside him. My strength was in patience, in waiting for the moment when his laughter would turn to shock. And when that moment came, I would not need to speak a word, because the truth would be written all over his face. There is something powerful about carrying a secret victory, something steadying about walking through life knowing you hold a card no one else can see. And that was how I lived in those days leading up to Florida. I smiled at him when he spoke, nodded when he mentioned his boys, acted as though I was none the wiser, And all the while I knew that soon enough, the house I had chosen, the keys I held, the life I had built would speak louder than any of his whispers. And in that thought I found peace, because for the first time in years, I wasn't living in his shadow. I was standing in my own light, quietly waiting for the day when the truth would finally be revealed. The days between his retirement party and the trip to Florida moved slowly, and yet each moment carried with it a strange calm for me, because while he was floating on excitement, grinning like a man who had just escaped a burden, I was carrying the secret of what I had already secured, and that secret steadied me in ways he could never understand. I watched him pack his bags with a kind of careless pride, choosing clothes he thought would impress his friends, talking about the restaurants they would try, the beaches they would walk, and every time he spoke the words, "me and the boys," I simply nodded, my smile soft but unshaken, because I knew something he didn't, that my own suitcase was already waiting, not for his approval or his invitation, but for the life I had chosen on my own terms. He spent hours on the phone with his friends, laughing like a young man again, planning excursions and golf outings, comparing villa details, and boasting about the view they would share. And I listened from the other room, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of detached amusement, because as he bragged about the villa, about how close it was to the ocean, about the sunsets they would watch with drinks in their hands, I thought of my own house, the one I had chosen carefully, the one that stood so close to his that he could not escape me even if he tried. And the thought of it gave me a strength so deep it spread through every breath I took, because betrayal had once broken me. But now it had become the very thing that lifted me higher. There were times at night when he would sit in his chair, a grin on his face as he stared off into some dream only he could see. And I would look at him quietly, remembering the years I had stood behind him, the years I had poured myself into keeping his world steady. And I wondered how a man could erase so much so easily. How he could speak of freedom while discarding the very person who had given him the foundation to stand on. But then, I would close my eyes and remind myself that he had not won. That while he believed he had written the ending of this story, it was already rewritten in my hands. And the keys to that new life were proof that he had underestimated me for far too long. I began to imagine more clearly the day we would both arrive in Florida. I could see the expression on his face when he stepped proudly into his villa, ready to begin a new chapter without me. Only to look across the way and find me already there, calm and unbothered, sipping from a glass with the sun warming my shoulders. And the more I imagined it, the more I realized that my revenge was not in grand gestures or loud confrontations, but in the simple, undeniable truth of my presence. Because there is no weapon more powerful than dignity carried in silence. And when the time came, my silence would be the loudest sound he had ever heard. That vision gave me peace, and it carried me through those final days of preparation, when he was so full of himself that he never even noticed the stillness in me, never wondered why I did not question him, never asked what I was planning, and I let him believe his fantasy. Because sometimes the sweetest justice is not tearing someone's dream apart, but standing quietly beside it, unshaken, with a dream of your own that shines even brighter. The day finally came when his long-planned dream turned into reality, and I could see the pride on his face as he wheeled his suitcase out the door. His voice humming with excitement as he spoke once more about the beaches and the freedom he was chasing. And though he thought he was leaving me behind, I carried myself with a calm so steady it almost frightened me, because I knew what was waiting on the other side. I knew that while he imagined a new life built without me, I had already planted myself in the very soil of that dream, and nothing he did could erase me from it. The flight was filled with his laughter, his jokes shared with his friends, the way he leaned back in his seat like a man who had conquered life itself. And I sat there quietly, not as a discarded shadow, but as a woman holding a secret too powerful to speak aloud. I let him talk. I let him boast. I let him smile as if he had already won. And in that silence, I felt my strength rise with every mile we traveled, closer to Florida. Closer to the moment when his world would change forever. When we arrived, the air was warm and heavy with the scent of salt and flowers, and his friends cheered as the car pulled up to their villa. He strutted inside like a king, his voice echoing off the walls as he marveled at the view. His chest lifted high as though this place was proof that his choices had been justified. But while he paraded through those rooms, I was already thinking of the home waiting for me just steps away. A home filled not with betrayal, but with quiet strength. Not with whispered lies, but with the peace of knowing it was mine, and mine alone. I waited until the next morning when the sun rose golden over the rooftops and he stepped outside with his coffee in hand, his friends trailing behind him, and I let that moment stretch. Let him breathe in the air of what he thought was his private victory, before I opened my own door, before I walked calmly onto the patio of the house next door. And the look on his face when his eyes met mine was everything I had imagined. His coffee cup nearly slipping from his hand, his jaw tightening, his friends staring in disbelief, and I simply lifted my glass, a soft smile on my lips. Because in that moment, he finally understood that I had not been left behind, that I had never needed him to write my future, and that the freedom he thought he had stolen was now standing right beside him, undeniable and unshaken. His face in that moment was something I will never forget. The way the color drained from his cheeks, the way his confident grin collapsed into silence, the way his friends shifted uncomfortably as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing, and all I did was raise my glass slowly, meeting his stare without a single word. Because sometimes silence cuts sharper than any voice ever could. I watched him stumble through a greeting, his voice uneven as he tried to sound casual, but there was no casual left, no hiding from the truth that stood right in front of him. And with every second that passed, the weight of my calm smile pressed heavier on his pride. He tried to regain himself, adjusting his shirt, straightening his shoulders, but the mask he had worn for so long had already cracked. He muttered something about coincidence, about how I must have decided last minute to come down, as if my presence there was an accident, as if I had somehow followed him in desperation. And I let him speak. I let him weave excuses, because the truth was written in my stillness. I had not followed. I had not begged. I had not stumbled into Florida by chance. I had stood firmly on my own, and the keys to the house beside his were proof of it. His words sounded weak in the morning air, flimsy against the strength of the life I had built without needing his hand to guide me. His friends looked from him to me, their eyes carrying questions they dared not ask, and I could feel the silence between us grow heavier. It was not anger that filled me, not revenge that burned in my chest, but a deep and steady satisfaction, because he now understood that betrayal does not erase the one you discard. Sometimes it forges them into something stronger. And I had become stronger. So much stronger than he ever thought I could be. I stood there not as his shadow, not as his burden, but as his equal, his neighbor, his reminder every single day that the freedom he believed he had stolen was never his alone to claim. And so I lifted my head, looked him straight in the eyes, and with a voice soft but certain I told him, "Retirement is about freedom. You take yours, and I will enjoy mine." Nothing more needed to be said, because the truth was already alive in the space between us. And as I turned back into my home, the sound of the door closing behind me felt like a final line drawn in the sand. Not of war, but of dignity. Not of bitterness, but of strength. And in that moment, I knew that no whisper of betrayal could ever define me again. When I stepped back into my own house that morning, closing the door gently behind me, I leaned against the wall and let out a breath I had been holding for far too long, not a breath of fear or exhaustion, but of release, because I had carried the weight of his betrayal quietly, and now the burden had shifted onto his shoulders. He would have to live with the sight of me each day, not broken, not begging, but thriving in the home I had chosen for myself, and I could already imagine the way it would gnaw at him every time he opened his door and saw mine standing tall beside it. Every time he walked past my windows and caught a glimpse of my peace. Every time his friends whispered behind his back about the woman he tried to erase who now lived closer to him than he ever wished. I moved slowly through the rooms, letting my fingers brush against the cool walls, feeling the sunlight spill across the floor, and I thought about how different this space felt compared to the years I had spent in the shadow of someone else's dreams. This was not a house built from his choices. It was a home shaped by mine. A place where my voice mattered, where my presence filled the air without being dismissed. And I could already sense the strength of that independence rooting itself deep inside me, steady and immovable. And for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. Later that day, as I unpacked boxes and placed things where they belonged, I heard him outside, his voice louder than usual, as if he needed the world to believe he was still in control. I could hear the forced laughter, the clinking of glasses, the shallow attempts to drown out the truth. But even without seeing his face, I knew that he was unsettled. Because pride can never sit comfortably when it has been shattered. And no matter how many jokes he told, no matter how loudly he tried to reclaim his confidence, the simple fact of my presence was louder. It spoke in silence, in calmness, in the unshaken way I went about my day. That evening, as the sky burned orange and the air softened with the scent of the sea, I sat outside with a glass in my hand and listened to the stillness, and I thought about how life has a way of turning pain into power when you least expect it. I had not raised my voice, I had not begged or pleaded, and yet I had won a victory deeper than anything anger could have given me. Because while he had tried to carve me out of his future, I had written myself back into it, not as his companion, but as my own woman, strong, dignified, and free. And the peace that settled over me in that moment was something he could never take away. No matter how loudly he laughed, or how many times he tried to convince himself I was nothing more than a shadow of his past. As the days turned into weeks, I watched the weight of his choices settle heavier and heavier on him. It showed in the way his laughter grew shorter, in the way his eyes darted toward my house whenever he thought no one was looking, in the way his friends began to ask quieter questions that he had no good answers for. And though he tried to carry himself with the same confidence he had flaunted at the party, the truth had already stripped him bare. Because dignity once lost is not so easily regained, and my presence alone reminded him of the truth he wanted to forget, that he had tried to erase me. But I had written myself into a life that would always stand beside his. Each morning when I stepped outside with my coffee, I could feel his eyes on me, and though he never spoke, his silence screamed. It carried all the things he could not say, all the excuses that no longer mattered, all the shame that words could never cover. And I let that silence hang between us like a mirror he could not turn away from. I did not need to confront him. I did not need to ask why, because the answer was already clear in the tension of his posture and the hollowness in his voice when he tried to pretend. And the sweetest part was knowing that he had done this to himself. His betrayal had not destroyed me. It had destroyed him. Inside my home, I began to live fully in the life I had claimed. I decorated each room with care, filling the space with reminders of strength and survival. I cooked meals that carried the warmth of my own choosing. I listened to music without worrying if it pleased anyone else. And in that freedom, I discovered a peace deeper than I ever thought possible. I was no longer defined by the sacrifices that had once drained me. I was no longer chained to the silence that once held me down. I was alive in every sense of the word, and that aliveness radiated in ways no betrayal could dim. At night, when the sky folded into darkness, and the sound of the waves reached softly through the air, I would sit quietly and think about the journey that brought me here. I thought about the whisper that once cut through my heart like a blade, and I thought about the smile I carried when I realized he could not erase me. And in those reflections, I found the lesson I wanted to hold on to. That betrayal is not the end. It is the beginning of a new strength. And sometimes the most powerful answer you can give to someone who tries to diminish you is not revenge, not anger, but the undeniable proof of your survival, your dignity, and your unshaken peace. And so as time went on, I no longer felt the sting of his whisper the way I once did. Instead, I carried it like a reminder of how far I had come, because what was meant to break me had only built me stronger. And every day I looked around my home, every time I breathed in the peace of a life I had chosen, I knew I had taken back what was mine. He could live with the weight of his decisions, but I lived with freedom, with dignity and with a quiet joy he could never touch. And that was enough for me, because sometimes the best revenge is not in words or in battles, but in the calm strength of simply living well. Thank you for staying with me till the very end of my story. Your time means so much to me. Please make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and share your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear from you.